You know, it's not every day that a town with fewer than 300 people makes national headlines. But back in the late 1990s, that's exactly what happened in Keystone, West Virginia, a little place most folks couldn't even find on a map. Well, this town became the epicenter of one of the biggest bank fraud cases in American history, all thanks to a man named J. Knox McConnell. And that, folks, is, yes, another one of the stories of Appalachia.
Steve, we've talked on our podcast before about some of the bank scandals, bank fraud, and so forth. I think some people might know of the one in Tennessee and stuff involving Jake Butcher and Ray Blanton and everything when he was governor of the state of Tennessee. But this is one that I'm sure that a lot of people probably weren't aware about, except if you lived in West Virginia, of course.
Well, yeah, I think it's getting a little bit more airplay, I guess, nowadays. But back when we did this on the audio podcast, which has been, about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, it really had not been heard of at that point. And, folks, this is a wild ride for such a little tiny town up in southern western West Virginia. So, Rod, you ready to get going?
I'm ready. Let's go.
All right. Well, folks, when you hear about a billion-dollar financial scandal, you probably picture Wall Street or some big bank in a place like New York City. You don't exactly think of a tiny coal town in McDowell County, West Virginia, named for the coal and coke company that ran it. But that's what makes this story so interesting. Keystone, population 176, as of the 2020 census, 65% of whom are black, by the way, wasn't exactly a world financial hub. In the 1970s, it was a typical small southern West Virginia coal town. But all that changed when along came J. Knox McConnell, and boy, did he shake things up, didn't he, Rod?
Yes, he did. And with a name like that, he'd shake a lot of things up, because J. Knox McConnell was born in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, in 1927. His dad, J. Knox Sr., as we will call him, was a wholesale candy man. Okay, you know, he's the kind of guy that goes and supplies the sweets to stores and vendors, but he wasn't just selling lollipops. He also sat on the board of directors for People's Union Bank and Trust Company. So at an early age, young Knox had a front row seat to the banking world. Now, unlike most kids growing up during the Great Depression, McConnell had it pretty easy. His family was well off, and he got to do things most kids could only dream of, like meeting celebrities. Well, when he was just 8 years old, he met Billy Conn, the famous Pittsburgh boxer who came this close to beating Joe Louis in 1941. Well, that meeting turned out to be a turning point for young Knox. You see, Conn took a liking to this kid and gave him a bit of career advice. Son, skip the boxing ring and go into banking, is pretty much what he told him. Said it was safer and it paid better. And you know what? McConnell took that advice to heart.
Well, Rod, after high school, he attended Hargrave Military Academy in Virginia, then did a brief stint in the Army after World War II. But it was banking that caught his interest. He enrolled at Waynesburg College, graduated in 1949, and took a job at the People's First National Bank in Pittsburgh, working in the credit department. From there, he went on to banking jobs in Oil City and Indiana, Pennsylvania, before eventually making his way back to Pittsburgh in 1958. There he managed Franklin Federal Bank in Squirrel Hill. But working for someone else just wasn't going to cut it. McConnell wanted his own bank. So in 1960, he tried to open one in Indiana County, Pennsylvania. Problem was, the local banking establishment wasn't having it. They saw him as a threat, a competitor, and fought to keep him out.
You know, Billy Conn had kind of told him, stay away from the fighting and stuff. Go into banking, do this. Well, this fight ended up in court and eventually reaching the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. But here's where McConnell's celebrity connections came in handy. His old buddy, Billy Conn, who we just mentioned, made a call to Art Rooney, the legendary founder of the Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm sure you probably have seen the pictures of an older man, glasses, very thick lenses on him. He was the legendary founder of this football team, and Rooney, as it turned out, had a connection to former NFL Commissioner Burt Bell. And guess what? Burt Bell's brother, just so happened to be John C. Bell Jr., a justice on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Okay, so we're kind of lining these things up into order here. Well, wouldn't you know it, the court ruled in McConnell's favor. Lucky guess. He got his bank, Conemaugh Valley Bank, and launched his first solo venture.
Well, old J. Knox later sold that bank and eventually got into international banking, with the U.S. Department of the Interior hiring him to run a development bank in Saipan in the Pacific Ocean in 1975. And there he would have stayed, but for the feds getting just a bit curious about just how much work he was doing. After an audit that found excessive travel and poor loan collections, J. Knox McConnell left the South Pacific and returned home to find new worlds to conquer. And that's where tiny Keystone, West Virginia comes in. Now, think about this. You got this ambitious banker with a flair for marketing and some, frankly, seriously creative accounting, just to be nice about it. Well, in 1977, he took over the First National Bank of Keystone, a sleepy little community bank with just $17 million in assets, and somehow turned it into a billion-dollar player. The First National Bank of Keystone had been around since 1904, making it through the Great Depression, taking care of the folks living in Keystone and that part of McDowell County. A typical small-town bank.
Gosh, this is unreal. McDowell County is a far cry from Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But McConnell saw potential. He came in as vice president, chief executive officer, and he immediately started making changes. And the first thing he did was bring in some reinforcements. And guess what? He brought two women in from Pittsburgh, Billy Cherry and Terry Lee Church. Now, Cherry was a former comptroller at a department building and his, on-again, off-again girlfriend. I'm not going to say anything else. And Church was a bookkeeper who had handled McConnell's affairs back home when he worked overseas in Saipan. These two quickly became McConnell's right-hand women, and according to local gossip, maybe a little bit more. Kind of fooling around with the assets, so to speak, okay? Well, the folks in Keystone started calling them, what a unique name, Knox's Foxes. Sounded like something Sean Connery would say in a James Bond movie. I'm here to see Knox's Foxes. Well, at that time, and as time went on, McConnell, by now the bank president, decided that simply taking care of McDowell County business was not going to cut it if the bank was going to grow, which he was determined that it would. Using his connections in Pittsburgh, he began providing discount mortgages to doctors in that city and began bringing in big bucks into First National. Then came the gimmicks, like giving out brand new Mustangs, Cadillacs, and Lincolns as interest payments on CDs. And when we say Lincolns, not $5 here, folks. We're talking about the cars, the Lincolns, as interest payment on CDs.
Yeah, I could see that being a hit, couldn't you?
Yeah, I could too.
Well, instead of getting a few percentage points in interest, think about this. Depositors drove off in shiny new cars.
Mm-hmm.
The car dealers got paid the interest. The bank saw a flood of new deposits. It was brilliant marketing, and it worked, at least for a little while. McConnell's ambitions soon had him taking the bank to the national stage. In the early 1990s, he came up with an idea that would make the First National Bank of Keystone a major player in the banking world with a new and innovative bank instrument. He started securitizing loans, which means bundling those loans up and then selling them for a profit. Think back to 2008, and that should sound familiar to you.
Yeah, I think there was a crash with that, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, there was. It was the same practice that tanked the economy back in 2008.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But at the time, McConnell made it look easy. The bank was raking in cash. well, on paper anyway. In 1996 alone, the bank in tiny Keystone, West Virginia, bought and sold $725 million worth of loans, accounting for about half the securitizations in America that year. How about that, Rod?
Well, there was some questionable practices, or at least how accounting was done on paper. Remember we mentioned that earlier? Well, Jay Knox moved on to selling off debt consolidation loans as well as mortgages. And at that point, federal authorities started getting, a little bit suspicious, and they intervened. And they ordered the bank to hire an outside accounting firm after an audit of the bank turned up things that just didn't smell right. And no, it wasn't the local sewer either. But good old J. Knox McConnell kept on trucking, confident that he'd do better in 1997, and he'd do better than he had in 1996. But then, in October of 1997, McConnell died suddenly at a state racing commission meeting in Morgantown. And that's where the house of cards began to fall. The whole mess ended up in the hands of Knox's foxes. Billy Cherry became the bank president, like that's a big surprise, and Terry Church took over the lucrative securitizations.
And Rod, at just this time, the market for those instruments started having problems. The loans weren't getting top dollar like they had been, and suddenly the bank was losing money instead of making it. And then the Fed stepped in again. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency insisted that the bank demote Miss Cherry and hire a president who kind of knew what they were doing as far as the ins and outs of securitization. That's when Owen Carney was hired on February 1st, 1998. But his management style clashed with the bank's shareholders, and they soon ousted him in favor of another banker. In the middle of all this, another audit was held of the bank's records in June, and at that point, the bank vice president, Michael Graham, announced that he had discovered a memo in which a federal regulator had made death threats against Knox's foxes, prompting the bank to hire armed guards to protect them. That in turn caused federal regulators to have armed U.S. Marshals protecting them as the audit continued. So they're kind of like a standoff there. In August, Graham and 5 other men got together on the 3rd floor of an old schoolhouse where the bank stored documents and proceeded to load box after box after box after box of records into a pickup truck. The truck then headed to the mountaintop home of Terry Church at Burke Mountain, where those boxes were buried in a 10-foot deep trench, almost like they wanted to hide something, don't you think, Rod?
I think so. And these were financial records. These weren't records like you'd hear of, I want my daddy's records, anything like this. These were financial records. And by this time, with what records regulators did have, try saying that a couple of times real fast, they found $500 million worth of discrepancies in the bank's records. You think? It was at this point that the Keystone Bank was, you guessed it, shut down. Federal authorities raided Church's property to recover the buried bank documents, and with Terry Lee Church and Michael Graham both convicted on obstruction and fraud charges. The other of Knox's foxes, Billy Cherry, was tried and convicted of bank fraud in 2001. 4 other employees pleaded guilty to their roles in the mess. The only one who got away with it, J. Knox McConnell, who was resting peacefully at Mount Vernon Cemetery in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, Steve.
Well, how about that? You go in there. I guess he took care of himself. He just conveniently passed away at just the right time, and everything fell on the people he'd brought in there. This is one of those stories that's just, almost unbelievable. How in the world do you go down to a little bank in a teeny tiny little town in McDowell County, West Virginia, and turn it into something that would rival any bank in New York or London or Paris or anywhere else on the planet? That's just something else, man.
It's mind-boggling. The whole thing of it is. And, I guess when all of this happened and, Jay Knox keeled over there at the Racing Commission meeting, I guess Billy Cherry found out that, her reign was not going to be forever. So, she just wasn't going to be Billy Cherry forever. She was going to be in trouble with the law, was what she was going to be.
Yeah. This was like a precursor of what happened in 2008, because just take this that we've told you today and multiply that by hundreds and hundreds and thousands of different banks around the world, and that's what caused the Great Recession that we all had to suffer through there early in the 2010s.
And I think some of this too, back especially there around the time of 2008 into 2010 and so forth, a lot of these were mortgage loans. A lot of these were housing loans and so forth, and it was one of those things of there were people getting loans that could barely go and buy a loaf of bread at the store, but they were getting loans, and then they were defaulting on them. And so you had this big chasm that just suddenly opened up, and it was like, hey, everybody kind of thought it was going to be the second coming of the stock market crash. A lot of people thought that. I know there were a lot of people that got scared over it, but, cooler heads prevailed. Well, what happened else with that? General Motors got in trouble. They ended up having to get bailed out with this whole thing. So it wasn't just the banking industry. It was some other areas of, that had some dealings with money involved as well.
Yeah, that's true. And as I said, this was the forerunner of every bit of that stuff. A very interesting story. The story of J. Knox McConnell and the First National Bank of Keystone. Another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for watching. Now be sure to subscribe if you've not done so already. You'll also find our audio version of the podcast on your favorite podcast app. Leave us a comment and give us a thumbs up too if you like this show. Till next we meet. Y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.